It's only the 10th lecture, and there would be much more to say, but it is already the 10th lecture, and those of you who have witnessed the previous 9 ones must be exhausted. So let's try to wrap up today. You may remember, or those of you who attended the full series, you may remember that I started off with an introduction about the history of linguistics and about the role that decontextualization and recontextualization play in the history of linguistics. Then I've shown in the rest of the talks how that form of contextualization, specifically socio-cultural, historical contextualization, can play a role in the study of meaning. So today I want to come back to the question of the history of linguistics, and then also to the question, what is the linguistic system? Now, in the course of these talks, I've tried to be as non-repetitive as possible. I've tried to bring something new with every talk, which is one of the reasons for your exhausted state at the moment. But in this talk, I will have to repeat something of what I said earlier, and I also want to do that to the benefit of those of you who've not witnessed the previous talks, and specifically those who've not witnessed the second talk in the series, because in the second talk we already talked about a certain conception of what a linguistic system could be. As usual, I'm giving a reference to a printed version, published version of the material that I'm presenting now. This has not yet been published, but it will be very soon. So the basic question for today is, if usage is variable, that has been the starting point of what we've done. If usage is variable, there is variation, and there is structured variation in language use, then there's another question to ask, namely, what is left of the linguistic system? If usage is variable, how systematic is the system? I want to deal with that question in 3 steps. First, I will try to give theoretical analysis of the question. What kind of question is this? What does it imply? Second, we'll do, as we've often done in the course of these series, descriptive study. What do the facts of language actually tell us? And then I'm coming back to the question of the history of linguistics. So I will be ending with the same topic with which I started on a meta-theoretical level. What's the wider context of all this? So the first step, what exactly is the question? Well, let me take 2 steps. First, I want to remind you that in a usage-based conception of language, linguistic systems are inevitably non-homogeneous. But then we automatically get to the question, if variation in usage, the heterogeneity of usage, is lectally structured, then how systematic is that variation? And you can think of it in this way. We have been talking a lot about lects, which, as you remember, is the cover term, the general term, the generic term I use for dialect, sociolect, register, stylistic levels, etc. But how certain can we be that lects exist? What would it be for a lect to exist? Well, that's about the question for, let's say, a dialect to exist. When can we speak of a dialect? So that's about the question that we are going to address today. So the first step, in a usage-based conception of language, linguistic systems are inevitably non-homogeneous. Let's repeat why. Let's go back to this question, what is the system in a usage-based conception of language? Well, I said before, this is the system in a usage-based conception of language. That was lecture 2. To repeat, the primary fact of linguistics is the behavior of language users, people talking. So again, as in the previous talk, in the second talk, I'm highlighting the parts of the previous graph here that are relevant for the specific steps I'm taking. So primary fact of linguistics is behavior of language users. What we call the system, what we traditionally call a linguistic system, for instance, a dialect or a language, is a secondary abstraction over the regularities in the primary behavior of the language users. We can say that there is a system if what they do at the bottom level has a specific form of regularity. And we as linguists are the one who deduce that regularity or induce that regularity maybe on the basis of what we find in our observational descriptions. Third, think now of the question, where do language users get their knowledge of the system from? Because going back to the previous slide, there is the system. We assume there is a system. We assume there is a system. And it's also, to some extent, in the head of the language users. The head of the language users, that's this thought cloud, right? And in the thought cloud, you have a representation of the system. And the representation that language users have in their heads influences the way they use language. Okay? But the question is then, where does the thing that language users have in their head, where does it come from? Where does knowledge of the language come from? Well, language users do not have direct access to the abstract description of the system that is on top of there. What they have access to is language use by other people. There's one nuance I want to add to this. It is, of course, true that there is formal schooling in language, that we have grammars and dictionaries, and they help to some extent to get knowledge of what is considered to be the system. Okay? That's a nuance. But in general, overall, the primary source of information, the primary source of linguistic knowledge for an individual language user is his or her interaction with other language users. That's what you see here. Language users do not align with the system directly, but they align with each other. They learn language by, in a very simplistic way, or putting it very simplistically, by imitating others. Right, but then these alignments, the way in which language users talk to each other, interact with each other, these alignments are incomplete in the sense that each individual language user does not interact with all members of the linguistic community, with all the speakers of the language. So your scope, your individual scope of interaction is limited, and it is socially limited. It has to do with your position within the linguistic community. So the incomplete alignments have a social structure. And you will remember that in the representation here, I have, in a sense, two overlapping social groups, right? I have the social groups of the speakers who wear skirts, and I have the social group of the speakers who are shaded. Two social groups as represented by the ovals, and they overlap. So there is, in the interactions, in the symbolically rendered interactions that you have here, there is a social structure. So, as a consequence, if we bring these steps together, what we can say is that lectal variation in usage, what we had in the previous slide, this fact, okay, that fact, oh, sorry, I'm going back. So, lectal variation is an integral part of a usage-based conception of the linguistic system. So the usage-based conception takes its starting point in saying it's the interactions between language users that leads to knowledge of the language. It's what language users do on the usage basis that actually gives us as linguists our basis for saying this is a language. But then if we accept that, the incompleteness of the interactions between all the members of a linguistic community has the inevitable consequence that we will have to look at the structuring of the interactions and how they influence the structure of the system. Okay? So that's the basic idea about the non-homogeneity of our notion of linguistic system in a usage-based model of language. It's non-homogeneous because we may assume that the different interactions lead to a different kind of, or to, let's say, a cluster of subsystems in our abstract description of the language. So far, so good. This was the part that I wanted to rehearse from the second lecture, and specifically for those of you who are new to this series. And now, let's take the following question. If we assume that indeed we have that kind of structure in our abstract description of languages, that if we assume that there is non-homogeneity, that there is heterogeneity, how far does it go? How unsystematic is the linguistic system? Or conversely, how systematic is the variation? Is it as simple as I suggest by this picture? Is it as simple as the picture that says, okay, you have clear social groups and we will find overlapping subsets in our description, or subsystems in our description? Well, it's an empirical question. It's not a question you can ask a priori. It's a question that you want to submit to descriptive research. Now, notice that when we ask that question, we are implicitly moving further and further away from the idea that the system, the language, is homogeneous. We know already, that was also what we discussed in the second lecture, that taking this socio-linguistic approach, to this variational approach to language, we move away from the idea of homogeneity that was implicit in a Saussurean and the Chomskyan conception of language. Because in both cases you have the notion of a homogeneous structure within a language, within a linguistic community. Remember Chomsky's ideal speaker-hearer, who knows the language perfectly. That's the idea of homogeneity. So we are moving away from that in the same way in which classical sociolinguistics, let's say Lebovian sociolinguistics does, to a conception of language as a heterogeneous system, and specifically as a cluster of dialects, sociolects, and other language varieties. Okay. That's the first step in getting away from the idea of homogeneity. Fine, but the question we are asking now is, if I once again come back to the picture, so if you take the upper picture, the upper part of the picture, a Chomskyan or a Saussurean approach would simply have, let's say, the middle thing here, would only have that. We now say, okay, we can see that we will probably have subsystems that form a cluster. But obviously, we can ask the same question that we raised with regard to a traditional view of the language. We can ask the same question with regard to each of those subsystems, with regard to each of our, let's call them now, dialects, or lects more generally. Are those dialects, are those lects internally homogeneous? The language may not be homogeneous, but are the lects homogeneous? That's the question we're asking at this point. So we are going from language system as heterogeneous in a classical sociolinguistic sense, as a cluster of lects, to the language as heterogeneous in an even more radical sense. And that would be the case if lects are just as virtually homogeneous as the old-time system used to be, but practically they would be heterogeneous. Okay. So this is a representation, a graphical representation of the steps we're taking. A homogeneous view of the classical type would say there's only one language and it's one and the same for all users for all members of the linguistic community. A more classical sociolinguistic approach would say, no, it's not that homogeneous. The language is actually, it's what you could call a polylectal system or a multilectal system. It's a cluster of individual lects. Okay. But we could go one step further and we could ask ourselves, yes, but maybe it's even worse than that, or maybe it's even more challenging than that, or it's even more dynamic than that. Maybe language is a complex dynamic system in which, to put it very radically, in a very extreme form, each expression, each type of expression in the representation, in the graphical representation here I say each construction, right? But more generally, each form of the language could have its own lectal distribution. That's what's expressed below. Instead of nicely, of constructions that have the same distribution over the social space, you would get separate characteristics for each expression, so to speak. So the way in which the expressions pattern together would be much more complex than what you get when you take the polylectal system, when you say we have dialects and they overlap nicely maybe in some cases, but generally dialects exist. We have to ask ourselves the question if it's not more extreme than that. To what extent do we maybe have a very complex structure in which each word, if we only think of words, then we could say, well, maybe each word does its own thing. Each word has its own values on the social dimensions, on, let me say, the lectal dimensions that are relevant in this linguistic community. That's a very radical view. We don't know yet whether it obtains or not, but the question now is rather, how on earth are we going to establish that? What essentially does it mean that there is such type of heterogeneity, that heterogeneity has this radical form? How would you go thinking about that and researching that, which is not such an easy question. So let's bring in the specialists, right? The people who've thought about this. Here they are. You're probably not familiar with them, or only to a very small extent. But these are two people who, in their own days, that's the second half of the 19th century, studied dialect variation in German. And these people were instrumental in defining what we know about the so-called Rhenish fan. The Rhenish fan. Who among you is familiar with the Rhenish fan? Probably no one. Yes. Okay, let me explain to you about the Rhenish fan. It's in the history of the Germanic languages. It's and specifically in the historical linguistics of Germanic languages. It's a fairly important concept. Why? So what did Wencker and Schmidt have to say about all this? Well, the Rhenish fan, what does it do? It describes the distribution of High German consonant changes in the border area between High German and Low German. Okay, what you have to know here is that if you look at the dialect level, then the geographical area where they now speak what we call German, that geographical area is split up in two major parts, the High German part and the Low German part. And that is on a linguistic basis. So High German has a number of consonant changes, a number of sound laws that are not present in Low German. And High German is the historically innovative part. So Low German, and Dutch, by the way, because that's one continuous area. High German and Dutch retain a number of older features that in High German have been replaced by others. And High German is the basis of what you might know as Standard German. Okay? But we're not talking here about the standard language, we're talking about the dialect. So the question is, how does the transition from the High German area to the Low German area happen. Now, there are a number of changes that are involved there, a number of consonant changes. And if you have a very clear boundary between the two areas, then the lines that you can draw on the map, okay, because you can draw lines on the map, right? You can say, okay, above this line they have the no, it would be the Low German consonant, and below the line they have the High German consonant. So you can draw what in dialectology are known as isoglossies. So you can draw these lines, and when the borderline between High German and Low German is very clear, then all the isoglosses, all the lines that you can draw for the individual elements, they all coincide. Then you have a strict borderline. But in actual fact, what these people found was that there is not one borderline, but that for the various individual consonants, for the various phenomena, linguistic phenomena that they were looking at, the lines more or less have a different distribution. And that distribution, that's what they call the Rhenish fan. Why? Well, Rhenish because this is the area of the river Rhine in Germany. That's why it's called Rhenish. And it's a fan because if you look at the lines, it's more or less like a fan. Like that. That's why it's called the Rhenish fan. So let's have a look at how that goes, what it looks like. And then I'll come back to the question, what does this have to do with our problem? Okay, you may not see that yet, but I'm coming to that. This is an example of the kind of phenomena that we have. So the first line, ik maak een dorp dat appel, that's what corresponds to Low German, the Low German distribution of the consonants. The number 6 one, that's what corresponds to the High German distribution. So look, for instance, at the K in ik, that means I, okay, ik as a K here, and as a fricative ge, ich in the lower one. So each of these columns, the ik one, the maken one, the dorp one, the dat one, the appel one, each of these columns corresponds to one of the changes, one of the consonant changes that together make up the High German consonant shift. And strictly speaking, if the borderline between High German and Low German is very strict, then what you would expect is that you would only have 1 and 6. Those would be the only configurations of the consonant changes that you find in the dialects. But in actual fact, you find other dialects. You find dialects like number 2 that only have the change in the K of ik and not in the other forms. You have dialects like 3 that have 2 out of 5 possible changes. You have dialects like 4 that have 3 out of 5 possible changes. And you have dialects like 5 that have 4 out of 5 possible changes. Actually, there are more than just 5 changes, but these suffice to give you the good idea of what's going on. And if we then track that, if we then map that onto a geographical map, you get this. Okay, let me immediately move to this one, which is a bit clearer. The red line here marks the distinction between the Romance language area, where they speak French, and the Germanic language area. So what's to the left of the red line is of no interest to us. The Rhine is here, that's the river, okay. And then the dialect boundaries are in blue. So as I said, you can draw these lines for each phenomenon separately, and you can see then, remember that I had these numbers for the different configurations of phenomena, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you look at the distribution of those areas over the linguistic area, then you see a gradual transition from a totally Low German situation to a totally High German situation. Okay? You go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And as you can see, it roughly takes the form of a fan if you look at the lines. Okay, I hope this is clear. Now what does this have to do with our problem here? Well, what we should do, I think, is to use the same method that the dialectologists used to establish if there is systematicity in our lects. Because what they do was essentially, let me go back to that, you have this type of distribution, or this variation in the distribution of the phenomena, and what they do is, the basic question they ask from a methodological point of view can be translated like this. If I have these different configurations of phenomena, can I then map, can I then correlate, associate these different configurations with clear lectal factors, with clear external factors, okay? And yes, that is the case because I have clear geographical areas for each of the different configurations. So how do we ultimately define, in this case, a dialect? Well, we implicitly define it. I must say implicitly because this is not something that is very often analytically analyzed in theoretical terms. But how do we implicitly define a dialect in this case? Well, we define it as a correlation between a cluster of co-occurring linguistic features and a number of external factors. And in dialectology, it's the co-occurrence of linguistic features on a certain geographical area. That's what defines a dialect. Ultimately, that's a simple idea, okay? You have external factors, which in dialectology in traditional dialectology are of a geographical nature, and within that set of external factors, within a certain set of external factors, you expect a systematic co-occurrence of a number of linguistic features. And those features are your linguistic system for that dialect. Okay? So you could say the linguistic system for dialect of the type 3 is that it has the High German form in the word final and in the word final position for the K and so on. You can define that in linguistic terms. So that's what you get as a linguistic system. And now, our situation. Our situation, 100 and, let's say, 20 years after those dialectological pioneers, our situation is much more difficult. Why? Okay, let me first say this. I should, because here you have a summary statement of what I wanted to say. So lects exist if there is a systematic correspondence between bundles of linguistic variables and then external socio-stylistic lectal parameters. Okay, so we will be looking for that systematic correspondence. But our situation is, yes, I'm illustrating it here. So that's what we assumed. A number of linguistic features corresponding nicely with clear lectal features and on the other side as well. Okay. So we don't believe in the linguistic system as necessarily homogeneous, but we wonder how the variation is structured on the basis of internally homogeneous lects or on a more fragmented basis. And we will try to check by looking for systematic correspondences between bundles of linguistic variables and sociolinguistic parameters. Okay. In other words, here's another one. Is another pioneer of linguistics that I need to mention. So in other words, we can say, I'm coming to the difficulties in a moment, don't worry. Should we take a Schuchert-like position with an unmitigated vindication of variation, gradients, contact, and even creolization, with a stress, in a sense, on impureness and unsystematicity? Why am I putting it this way? Well, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in the 19th century, you had this dominant position of so-called neo-grammarian theory in the study of historical linguistics. And the neo-grammarians had the idea that languages changed in a very systematic way. They introduced this notion of the absence of exceptions. Sound laws, the major force in the change of language, they thought, sound laws do not accept exceptions. But Schuchard was one of the few voices in the late 19th century who opposed that position and who said things like, each word has its own history. Now, if you say from a historical point of view, each word has its own history, that's roughly the same thing as what we are saying now from a synchronic, or what we are investigating now, from a synchronic point of view. Each form, each expression, each construction may have its own lectal distribution. Okay. So the extreme position that we are investigating, if we think of it in terms of the history of linguistics, would be a Schuchard-like position. Okay. And I'm coming, as I predicted, or as I said in the beginning, I will be coming back to the history of linguistics at the very end of the talk. So, okay, this is what we want to know. Do we, when we look at lectal variation from the point of view of the correlation of specific phenomena with external factors, do we get internal homogeneity of lects or not? So what do the facts of language tell us? Okay. Now, first, something about the difficulty we have. Suppose we have a difficulty. Why is our situation more complicated than for the 19th century dialectologists? Well, basically, we want to have a look at much more lectal factors, much more external factors than the dialectologists did. We don't just look at geographical distribution, but we look at all forms, all possible forms of lectal distribution at the same time. We would want to know, to the extent that it is possible, what the role is of social factors, traditional speaker characteristics, stylistic registers, and also geographical differences. So that means that we again have a methodological problem. What we cannot do is simply to draw maps in the way in which the dialectologists in the 19th century did. Because our conception of what the external factors of the language look like, the relevant factors look like, is much more intricate, much more complicated. And notice, for those of you who were present at yesterday's lecture, it's basically of the same kind as what we discussed yesterday. Again, we are faced with a problem of multifactoriality, a methodological problem that derives from the fact that we want to have a look at various factors at the same time. Like what we did with our regression analysis yesterday, that's looking at various factors at the same time. Here we basically have a similar problem. We are looking at, in contrast with Winkler and Schmidt, we can't just look at one dimension, the geographical one, but we want to have a look at various external dimensions at the same time. Okay, so let me show you very briefly how we can do that. So I'm going to present a study that we did in our research team on the morphological markers of colloquial Belgian Dutch. You may remember that we've already talked about Belgian Dutch, that we also saw in one of the talks that the distance between colloquial Belgian Dutch, you remember the shop window material we had for the clothing terms, is more distant from the standard Belgian Dutch language than it is in the Netherlands. So we know a bit about that. But in this case, we're going to focus on colloquial Belgian Dutch and basically ask ourselves the question, is it a homogeneous lect or not? To what extent is it internally homogeneous? We know there is a substandard, informal, colloquial form of spoken Dutch in Belgium, but how clearly does it constitute a, well, lect or dialect? So what I want to do, but this is something I want to do very, very quickly because it's not all of this is relevant for this talk, is to go through a number of steps to introduce the material. I'll first say something about what the external parameters are, but basically those of you who've witnessed the other talks are basically familiar with those. Then I'll say something about the linguistic variables. Then, and that's interesting because that's the solution to the problem I just sketched. I'll say something about the methods, and then of course we'll get the results. Okay, briefly. The socio-stylistic parameters, again, we are here using the spoken Dutch corpus, which I already introduced. And as we know already, it's differentiated according to stylistic components, but we have other forms of variation there: province, generation, gender, educational level, and occupational level. So it is, lecturally speaking, a highly structured corpus, or at least a corpus with various lectal factors that might be interesting from the point of view of the question we're asking. These are the different register components, but we've already seen those in a previous talk. The provinces we have, yes, notice that in this case we are only looking at Belgian Dutch. So we have 4 provinces here, or at least 4 provincial areas: the Brabantic, the East Flanders, the West Flanders, and the Limburg area. We already know about the Limburg area. We looked at that from another perspective. Then gender, that's clear. Then generation, that's nice. We have 5 generations with curious names, which we take from sociological research. We didn't invent them. We have the pre-war generation. We have the so-called silent generation, which was born between 1930 and 1939. We have the protest generation, the 1968 generation, if you wish, which was born between 40 and 45. And then the lost generation, born between 55 and 1970. And the pragmatic generation, born after 1970. Why am I saying this? Well, note the abbreviations. I will be showing plots in which you will find the same abbreviations. Okay. And then educational level, higher education, middle, low, and occupation, sort of hierarchy of different levels of status, if you wish. So there's a lot that you can do with that to check whether external lectal variables are relevant for the distribution you find. Now, the linguistic variables, we have a very large collection of morphological phenomena that, from the nominal and the verbal morphology of Dutch, that could be typical, or that are sometimes considered to be typical of colloquial Dutch in Belgium. I'm giving you only one example because it's not really necessary for this talk to go into the details here. Take the formation of a diminutive. Okay? Dutch has the possibility of making diminutives of noun. So if you have a word like chair, stoel in Dutch, and you want to express a small chair, then in standard Dutch you would say stoeltje. Okay? That's the regular form of making a diminutive in standard Dutch. In colloquial Belgian Dutch, the form of the diminutive morpheme is different. There it's not tje, but in the case of stoel, it would be stoeleke. So obviously, when we have the spoken material and we analyze the material, then we can establish whether the diminutive that we hear is the colloquial diminutive or not. And then, of course, when you do that and when you have that, you can then chart, you can then analyze whether the distribution of the diminutive corresponds to certain lectal factors or to combinations of lectal factors, the external ones that we mentioned here. Okay. And the method then, so as I already indicated, in contrast with the Rienesch-Van, we deal with a multidimensional space of variation. Not just geographical space, but all these things that we mentioned here, province, gender, generation, register components, etc. All of those could together be the foundation, form the basis for defining lects, homogeneous language varieties. So what are we going to use? Well, in this case, we again use a specific statistical technique, an exploratory statistical technique, which is known as correspondence analysis. We've already gone through a number of statistical techniques. If you ever wonder why are statistics necessary, well, I hope I can show that it is useful. Okay? Once you get to deal with complex data sets of the kind that we have been dealing with and that we feel that we need to deal with, then it's necessary to have recourse to statistics because you can't do it yourself. When you do the analysis yourself, it's bound to be superficial, and we want to go further than that. So what is a kind of technique that you can use for this kind of material? Well, the kind of technique that we use here is known as correspondence analysis. It's one of the lesser known forms of statistical analysis, but for those of you who know a bit about statistics, it's quite interesting for linguistic research because it's very interesting for dealing with so-called categorical data, with count data, whereas similar types of analysis that are better known, like principal component analysis, are actually more geared towards the analysis of numerical data. Okay, that's technical background. Don't worry if you have no affinity with that. So what do we do? What does the program do? What does the statistical analysis do? It tries to see if there is a correlation between the presence of one of our linguistic variables and one of our lectal variables, one of our external variables. And what do we expect? That's the crucial point here. If we have homogeneous lects, what do we expect? Then we will expect that a number of linguistic features cluster together in the neighborhood of one or more lectal variables. Okay? We get clear structure, clear lectal structure, if the correspondence analysis shows a correlation between bundles of linguistic features and bundles, or at least one, but maybe bundles of lectal external features. Okay? So that would have to come out of the analysis. But oh yes, this is what I said. So what we expect is a clear lectal structure, a number of linguistic variables clustered together in the vicinity of one or more external lectal variables. But nothing of the sort happens. Just look at this. Just look at the overall picture here. I have quite a number of graphs here, but we don't need to look at all of them. The black dots, the black abbreviations, labels, refer to the linguistic variables, like the diminutive. The red ones refer to the lectal variables. So, for instance, the simple letters like F and J refer to the components, the stylistic components of the corpus. And here we have, for instance, a few provinces. Lim is Limburg, the province that we've already come across. So what we see is that in the overall structure of this correspondence analysis. Okay, things do cluster together in the middle, but otherwise there's no very clear structure. We can't say very well that things really form a clear architecture of different licks. It's not the case, for instance, that if you take, let's say, F, that you find a number of linguistic features that are situated in the immediate neighborhood of F. So try to think of this as a contemporary translation of the kind of map that we saw for the Rhenish fan. And in the Rhenish fan, we saw that in spite of the apparent heterogeneity, there is a clear geographical structure in the way in which the heterogeneity is distributed over, in which the various variants are distributed over the geographical area. So here we are asking the same question. If we're doing the correspondence analysis, can we see whether the various linguistic forms are nicely distributed over the lectal space of variation? Well, that's not the case. There is no clear stratification, but we get graded positions in the space of variation. Now, does that mean that there is no structure at all? This does seem to contradict the idea that lects are clearly homogeneous structures. Probably not. But does that mean that there is no structure at all? No, because we can identify a number of underlying dimensions. So, as I said, this is the total picture, but we can now zoom in on separate external dimensions. We can zoom in, for instance, on register, that is to say, in this case, on the components of the spoken Dutch corpus. And you will remember from the other time that the components of the spoken Dutch corpus are themselves situated on a number of dimensions, like public speech versus private speech, prepared speech versus spontaneous speech, dialogues versus monologues. So if we do that, do we now find structure? Well, we don't find a clear stratification, but we do find continuous dimensions. How do we see that? Well, you have to look here at the placing, at the position of the various register components of the spoken Dutch corpus. So they are labeled as B, H, L, C, D, and so on. Okay. Now, if we interpret, so what you, let me first say this. So what you see is that you get at least some kind of horizontal dimension here on which O, B, H, L, I, J, K, that is, I can't read that, B and C are situated. So there is a dimension. It's not just pure arbitrariness. There is a dimension in which the components are ordered. And the question is, can we interpret that dimension? Is that a meaningful dimension? Well, it appears to be the case. If we look at what O, B, C, D, and so on are, then we can say, yes, the horizontal dimension is precisely the distinction between public and private speech. Okay? Public speech to the left, private speech to the right. Fine. And does that correspond with a linguistic difference? If we then look at the variables, the linguistic variables that we find to the left and to the right, does it make sense that we have this distribution? Yes, because what I'm doing now is to use a green color for the informal variants and a blue color for the standard Dutch variants. So if we compare this, and again this is for register, and I'm now zooming in fact, on the central cluster here. I'm now zooming in on this part. So what we find is a dimension of public versus private speech, and on the side of the private speech, we find the colloquialisms. We find, which is obvious, which is precisely what we expect. We find the specific markers of colloquial Belgian Dutch. So I'm zooming in, and you can see that the colloquialisms are to the right. I'm zooming in further. I'm zooming in even further. And it's not a totally clear-cut picture. It's not that you can simply draw a line, but in general, the pattern is there. And even further. Okay. I could do this again for other external variables. So I could look for region. Is there something that is typical for one of the provinces, for instance? Well, there are just a few things of which you can say that they are typical for provinces. For instance, for the province of Western Flanders, this linguistic variable seems to be typical. But that's only one. I'm not going to explain which one it is, what it involves, but this one is just one typical variable. But that doesn't give you a lect. One variable doesn't constitute a lect, I would say. And so on for generation, for gender, for educational level, for professional level. The picture is always the same. The lectal parameters, the external parameters, roughly reveal the same pattern. Lectal dimensions do play a role, as expected, but there is no Rienisch-Fan effect. That is to say, the linguistic variables do not cluster into discrete lects or strata. Rather, there are underlying dimensions, and each form may seem to have its own position on the various dimensions. Now, there are some refinements that you could apply here, some questions, critical questions that you could ask, and one of them is whether we might not be defining our lects too broadly. What happens if we break down the lects by considering interactions between lectal dimensions? So now we've looked at a component separately, but what if we would say, okay, it's not the register component or the province as such, but it's, for instance, the speech of highly educated female speakers in one of the provinces. And that's a more restricted definition of lects. But that doesn't really help. I can give you a few examples here. So what, for instance, pra.f, that would be the female speakers of the so-called pragmatic generation. You remember that we had these different generations. But the picture is, again, roughly the same. I could go to hundreds of charts like that with the same material, but it's always the same picture that emerges. So we can say that the entire picture, well, turns out to be rather of the Schuchart type than of the neo-grammarian type. Lectal dimensions play a role, play a distinct role, but the values that linguistic variables occupy on the lectal dimensions are ordered along a continuum rather than by categorical stratification. And if we turn the perspective around, we can now say that if lects exist at all, they would exist with a prototype structure, as Professor Christensen has also stressed in her talk and in publications. That is to say, linguistic variables may be more or less characteristic of a lect, and each variable may seem to have its own position. Okay. So we should probably take into account a bit more variation than we tend to do. We've taken this step from thinking about language as a homogeneous system to thinking about language as a cluster of lects, but we should probably go even further. What does all of that mean in a wider context of the history of linguistics? Well, remember that in the first talk I took the history of 20th century linguistics, but here I've already brought in a few ideas from 19th century linguistics. So let me now try to do that more systematically and say a bit more about the relationship between 19th century linguistics and 21st century linguistics. Okay, we find evidence for a fairly extreme deconstruction of the notion of linguistic system. If the language exists as a system, then probably only as what is sometimes called a complex dynamic system. And if lects exist as separate entities within such complex dynamic systems, then only to the extent that they have prototype structure. But what does that mean for contemporary linguistics? Well, again, something that I've stressed before in this talk. If lectal variation is as Schuchert-like as suggested here, then all constructions may have their own lectal distribution. And then, of course, the lectal distribution of the constructions should be included in the study of such constructions. Because you could no longer simply say, I am looking at colloquial Belgian Dutch as something internally homogeneous, and I'm looking within that linguistic system. And I don't have to bother about the variation within that linguistic system, because within that linguistic system there is no variation. Linguistic systems at the lectal level are homogeneous. No, that's not what you could do if this is correct. So we have to include variation in the study of constructions. Again, it's the same conclusion that we reached yesterday. We need a lectally enriched, multivariate usage-based grammar. Now, this desystemization of the linguistic system, seems to be accompanied in cognitive linguistics by another form of desystemization of the linguistic system. What I'm talking about here is a desystemization of the system from the point of view of variation. Its distribution over lectal variables. But if you think about it, you could also say that there is that we move away from a certain systemic view of the linguistic system in another respect in cognitive linguistics, from the point of view of grammar, that is. And I'm coming to that, but in both cases, what we can say is that we see the mirror image, not a mirror image, to a certain extent, but that we see a reflection, a repetition almost, of something that happened in the 19th century, or that we find in 19th century debates. Okay, here we go. What is the standard view in the 19th century of language from the point of view of the internal structure of the language and from the point of view of language variation? Okay. That's what I'm calling here the external perspective and the internal perspective. The external perspective has to do with language variation, with questions like what do you call a language and what do you call a lect? The internal perspective has something to do with what's the grammar? Okay. What's the internal architecture of the grammar? And in the 19th century we get a standard view on both levels and a positional view. And by now we know them. We've hinted at them or referred to them in the course of this talk. The standard view with regard to language variation is the so-called family tree model, Schleicher's view, which presupposes internally homogeneous languages. That's the view where you have a mother language which splits up in daughter languages, and each of the daughter languages is its own system. Okay. And as opposed to that, we have the view of Schmidt and Wenke, which we refer to. Namely, between languages, or between what we would consider languages or language areas like High German and Low German, there's no strict separation, but there are borderline cases. There are transitional zones. So the structure is much more confused or at least much more fuzzy than what the family tree model presupposes. With regard to the internal structure of grammar, the neo-grammarians, as we mentioned, put forward the idea of exceptionlessness, so high systematicity. In German, it's Ausnahmslosigkeit, exceptionlessness, of sound change. You can call that a rule-based approach. One phoneme changes to another in all circumstances. No exceptions. Zip. That's the way it happens. Clear, neat rules. Compared to that, people like Schuchart said, or people like Schuchart proposed a rather lexicon-based model of change. Each word may have its own history. What I mention here is Über die Lautgesetze gegen die Junggrammatiker. That's the title of a work by Schuchart. Against sound laws, or rather, with regard to sound laws, against the neo-grammarians. Okay. So you get, on the one hand, the idea of clear lectal structure versus the idea of lectal fuzziness. On the other level, you get the idea of a rule-based approach versus a lexicon-based model. The Surian-Chomskyan approaches versus what I've been calling in this, in this talk a complex dynamic system approach to language, or if you wish, a more fuzzy approach. And with regard to the internal perspective, there we have to explain something. Okay, because that's something that we haven't discussed yet. So the question here is, can the picture be filled out with regard to the internal perspective? Well, a traditional system-oriented view of the grammar implies that rules and patterns and lexical items, so rules and patterns on the one hand and lexical items on the other hand, are strictly separated classes of linguistic forms. And the systematicity of the language is embodied in the rules, and the irregularities and exceptions are lexical. You probably know this famous dictum that the vocabulary is the repository of all the exceptions in the language. Okay. A more contemporary cognitive linguistic view holds that there is a continuum of forms with hybrid constructs intermediate between rules and items. That's one of the basic ideas of construction grammar, of so-called construction grammar. And also, another aspect of that is that if you think about rules, you think of how they apply to words, even syntactic rules. The question is how they apply to words. So if you measure the productivity or the scope of a rule in terms of its lexical scope, to what items it can apply, then also in recent cognitive linguistics research, you would say that there is a continuum of regularity. The actual lexicalization of syntactic patterns, for instance, is part of their structures. Some of them apply to large areas of the vocabulary, others are collocationally more restricted, if you wish. So what we see, in a sense, is that recent grammatical theory, at least within the confines of cognitive linguistics, is also moving in the same direction of this, if we can put it that way, this anti-neo-grammarian position that Schuchart had, that we have to take into account the lexicon even when we have a look at the structure of the language. So that means, to put it in an aphoristic way, to fill out the chart in an aphoristic way, the internal perspective in the conventional late 19th, 20th century view of grammar would be rules rule, okay, or if you want to put it in still another way, pure rules, poor lexicon. That was the basic position. In contemporary approaches, it's rather like saying no rules, great constructions. So if you believe me on this, and you will be by now, if you have enough affinity with cognitive linguistics to see that these are all things that are happening in a cognitive linguistic environment, and you also see that we're now reaching a position at the beginning of the 21st century which is reflecting the same type of contrast with a more strict approach as what we had in the 19th century. And so, to conclude, if lectal variation is as Schuchert-like as suggested here, then, to repeat, all constructions may have their own lectal distribution, and lectal variation should be included in the study of any construction. Second, we can couple this form of desystemization of thinking about language to what's happening in the grammatical models of cognitive linguistics. So the grammatical models of cognitive linguistics, like construction grammar, the variational model of usage-based linguistics, they belong closely together because both embody complementary aspects of the desystematizing trend in contemporary linguistics. And that's maybe the bottom line of what I've tried to show in these 10 lectures. Once again, I would like to thank you very, very much for your attention and for all the interesting questions you've asked. There's still time for more questions, but for all the previous ones, thank you.